And in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, be with us tonight as we study your sacred word, and be especially with Megan as she recovers, and know that our prayers are with her. Open our hearts to your word, Lord. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. All right, so on to the share screen. And you guys get a special treat tonight because we are going to actually cover the whole book of Joshua, and you will find out why when I finish. But as always, we will start with our review. So we have creation of the universe, and particularly of Adam and Eve. And a covenant is formed between God and one holy couple. And that holy couple, in order to sustain that covenant and stay forever with God in the Garden of Eden, can't eat from the tree of knowledge. But they do. They want to be like God and know right from wrong. So they eat from the tree, and that is the fall, the original sin. And because of it, God separates them from the tree of life. Death enters the world. And outside the Garden of Eden, they start procreating. And people get evil fast, and God decides that they're so evil, he's going to start again. He's going to make a covenant with one holy family. Noah's a righteous man. So he takes his wife and children, their sons and his sons and their wives, and they get on an ark, and their world is flooded. And when they get back off, all things start again. But because of original sin, they head right back downhill. They decide again that they're going to find their own way to heaven. So they start building this great big, tall ziggurat. And that ziggurat is trying to reach to heaven. And so God confuses their languages at Babel. Finally, he's able to call one man back. He chooses Abraham, and he asks Abraham to leave Ur and to travel to Canaan. And he shows him the promised land and tells him that he's going to have descendants. And he surely does. He has a son named Isaac. Isaac is a type of Christ. At one point, Abraham is asked by God to sacrifice Isaac as a test of his faith. And he passes that. Just as he raises the knife, the angel of the Lord stops him. And so then Isaac goes on to get married. He has two sons, Esau and Jacob, but Jacob steals his birthright. So God's story is going to continue through Jacob's line instead of Esau's. Jacob's name is finally changed to Israel by God, and he has 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. His 11th son, Joseph, is despised by his older brothers because he's Papa's favorite, and he is sold into slavery in Egypt. But there, he predicts for the Pharaoh that there's going to be a great famine. First, there'll be a great plenty, and then a great famine. And Pharaoh puts him second in command in Egypt. And his brothers, who are in Canaan with his father, actually have to travel to Egypt to get food because they're also affected by this famine. And their brother Joseph redeems them. And he also reveals to them that he is their brother. And he sends them back to get their father, Jacob or Israel, and bring him to Egypt. And before he leaves, Jacob sacrifices to Yahweh, the one God, and celebrates that his son is alive. And then he heads for Egypt. In Egypt, the whole tribe is kept apart from the Egyptians. That's the sanctification. They're kept holy and kept apart, and they thrive. And the tribes become very large and very wealthy, and it scares the Egyptian pharaohs. who have by now forgotten who Joseph was. And so they decide to enslave the Israelis and Israelites. And so they go into slavery making bricks. That's the tragedy as they fall into slavery and transition from being free men into slaves. Then we have the coverage of 400 years while they serve their Egyptian masters. And at the very end of that 400 years, an Israeli woman who's supposed to drown her firstborn doesn't. She puts him in a basket, floats him on the Nile. The Pharaoh's daughter picks him out. She raises him as an Egyptian. However, he figures out he's a Hebrew. He ends up killing another Egyptian, and then he flees to Midian to go see Jethro, who will become his father-in-law, and his wife Zipporah comes from the Midianites, and he's very happy there. He's formed a family, he's herding sheep, he likes it, but he sees a burning bush on a hillside, and he goes to that burning bush, and the voice of God speaks to him, and he tells him his name, Yahweh, which means I am who I am. And Yahweh commands him to go back to Egypt and get his people out of Egypt. And Moses does that. There are all sorts of miracles that are worked and all sorts of plagues. And the last plague is the plague where the firstborn of all beasts and all men die, except for the Israelites, because they're told to sacrifice an unblemished lamb, to take its blood, to smear it on their door lintels and posts, and that the angel of death will pass over them. And surely that is what happens. Pharaoh loses his only son, and when he loses that son, he decides to free Israel. And so God works another great miracle. Moses raises his rod above the waters of the Red Sea. It parts. They walk through on dry land, and the Egyptians are drowned. On the other side, Israel makes their way to Mount Sinai. And on Mount Sinai, Moses meets with God. And again, we have a theophany, right? Thunder, lightning, clouds. And God speaks to Moses, and he gives him the 10 commandments and other laws that Israel is to obey. And he makes a covenant with the Israeli people. And he says, now he's making his covenant with one nation, right? It went from one couple to one family, now to one nation, the tribes of Israel. And they'll be his people, but they have to follow his commands. So that's their covenant. And then they have to wander in the desert for 40 years, because when they finally make their way to the chosen land, they chicken out. They send 12 spies up to spy out the land. 10 of them come back and say, oh, we can't do it. We can't do it. And 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, say that they can do it, but nobody will listen to them. And so as a punishment for every day that they were spying, they have to wander 1 year in the desert. So they've wandered for 40 years. God told them, everybody who was in that generation that rebelled against me has to die. It will be your sons and daughters who enter the promised land, all except for Joshua and Caleb. So Moses passes away. Joshua takes command. And last week we saw them actually defeat a bunch of armies on the east side of the Jordan River. And that was where we left them, was on the east side of the Jordan, out in the plains of Moab. So now, before we start this continued getting of the promised land, because I was a naval officer, I was given the opportunity to go to a master's program at the Naval War College. And there we had a course on strategy and policy. And one of the books we had to read was Clausewitz, Karl von Clausewitz. You can see he lived from 1780 to 1831. Probably he fought in many, many battles. Brilliant, brilliant man. But the one that you would probably be most familiar with is the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon was finally defeated, and the face of Europe was reshaped after that battle. Clausewitz was a Prussian general who he wrote about the theory of war. He fought in all sorts of wars, and I thought it would be instructive. We still study it in the US military, his book on the art of war. And one of the things that Clausewitz says is that war is an active force to compel our enemy to do our will. Absolute war is waged with the unwavering aim of completely defeating the enemy. But it's contrary to human nature to make extreme efforts. An absolute war requires total commitment. Now, Clausewitz goes on to say that the only war you should ever fight is an absolute war, because if you don't totally break the will of your enemy and you don't totally subdue him, he will come back at you at a later time. And so his first recommendation is don't fight a war unless you're going to fight an absolute war. But then he makes this observation that most people just can't do that because it takes such extreme effort. And so then he talks about kind-hearted people. He says, kind-hearted people might think there were some ingenious way to disarm or defeat an enemy without too much bloodshed, and might imagine this is the true goal of the art of war. Pleasant as it sounds, this is a fallacy that must be exposed. He cautions against going to war unless you have the political goal that is achievable by your military. If you're going to waver back and forth, if you're going to want to save the enemy, then you shouldn't fight the war, because that's not what war is about. And then he says, woe to the government, which relying on half-hearted politics and a shackled military policy, meets a foe who, like the untamed elements, knows no law other than his power. Now, Clausewitz is talking in a radically more civilized world back in the 1800s than existed back 1400 BC when Moses lived. Absolute war was what those tribes fought, right? They were vicious. They were, when you read about the things that they did, and when we start even studying history after Jesus ascends back up into heaven, right? When we finish scripture, we're going to do several weeks worth of history of the church. You will just see how vicious the world was at the time of Rome. We'll magnify that by about 20 times. And now you're looking at the viciousness of the tribes that exist and the trouble when they run into each other. And right, last week we saw, even when they went to some of these Canaanite tribes and Amorite tribes, and they said, hey, listen, we're just going to stay right on the highway. We're just going to move right on through. We don't want this land. We want other land. Well, they weren't allowed safe passage. They were attacked by the other tribes, right? It was not a friendly world back there. And so when we look at it in our culture's eyes, right, we have become this kind of half-hearted political entity with a shackled military policy. It's a necessity of the time. There is not a will, and thankfully so, right? Jesus, God has this goal in mind, right? He's made the political goal. It's not really a political goal, it's a religious goal. I have got to get through these barbarians, this barbaric tribes, in order to make a path for my son. I need to have the fullness of time when I can send my son into the world to show all of these people who are living with this original sin, this temptation to be horrible people. I need to show them what I, God, really want them to live like. But first, I have to make room for that. And so he takes the Israeli people under his wings, and he makes that space where finally God can enter into history. And it's so, while it seems tremendously barbaric to us, you really have to see it in the eyes back then. Even in the eyes of an it was somebody writing in essentially the 19th century after Christ, you can see that war still remains not a pleasant thing, and something that must be taken on very seriously if you're going to actually achieve your goal. The other thing you need to think about, this foe who, like the untamed elements, we have seen him, most of us in our day. We have seen Adolf Hitler. We have seen millions killed in other parts of the world, Africa, when the Hutsis and Tutus went to war. Pol Pot was another great example of this untamed power who will relentlessly kill millions. And even the United States was forced to it in the Second World War, right? We've been fighting a long war. We have an enemy that will fight to the very last man, Japan. And we have people who are getting tired here in our own country. And so President Truman made the decision to drop nuclear weapons on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It falls into this theory of warfare, right? He's meeting up with this foe who's like the untamed elements, and he's got flagging willpower back home. Too many sons and daughters have died, and what extremes we will go to in ultimate war. The other thing that you have to remember in the Bible is Moses is fighting these wars. He's recorded it, but now we've got these people who are, in different traditions, who are writing down the story and kind of adding some comments to it and adding their own. Even Jeff Cavins in his footnotes, if you read them, says that the ban on these holy wars to kill everybody and everything was probably not practiced as much as is recorded in the Bible. But, we don't really know that, but we suspect it. So anyway,
Chris,
yes, sure, Dewey.
I just was horrified, absolutely horrified with these readings. I could see no justification for the brutality, for the way that they tricked those people just to go in and take their land, and then so brutally massacred them. And I mean it. I thought, why did we read this? I never dreamed it was that bad. So
yeah.
I have trouble seeing what you're saying. I really do.
And hence why it's hard for people to understand what the world was like back then, and even our military right now. I mean, it's part of the problem that the military got into in Vietnam when we fight limited warfares, and that's what Karl von Clausewitz warned against. If you fight a limited warfare where you're going to just try to leave as many people alive as you can, it only works if you have a very submissive people. If you have that untamed enemy, what they'll do is they'll put explosives on a young child and send them into your troops. They'll booby trap hospitals. They'll set up their military centers in old folks' homes where you have to kill old people to get at their communication center. War is a hideous thing. That's why you should never enter it unless you've thought greatly about what your political goal is and can hold that political goal long enough. And I'm talking in a modern day culture, which is extraordinarily civilized compared to these tribes back then. If, let's say that for some reason God brought Israel out of Egypt and didn't help them at all, he didn't give them any power, those other tribes would have destroyed them the way they destroyed these tribes. It wasn't like they weren't fighting constantly amongst themselves. They were. They were always fighting for dominance. You even see that within the American Indians. If you go back and study American history, it wasn't like all the Indian tribes were super peaceful among themselves. They were massacring each other, right? They had little things like digging a hole in the sand and burying somebody up to their neck and then letting them die in the desert. And in Africa, there's the trick of burying them near ant hills where the ants eat them slowly. The depth of original sin is huge. And it's like I said, God is trying to take a bunch of rabid dogs, which even to this day, our rabidness has decreased a lot. And it is horrifying. It's so horrifying to many people that even several hundred years after the Bible was written, there were lots of Christians now who were saying, you need to get rid of the Old Testament. That was a different God. He was an angry God. He was a mean God. And he was evil. And now we have Christ, and he's a good God. And so throw away the Old Testament. But you can't do that, because if you throw away the Old Testament, you can't understand the New Testament. Jesus came from these people. And yes, it was barbaric, but it was of their culture and their time. And it is horrifying, Dewey. I'm not trying to say that it wasn't, but I am trying to say that it's it reminds me, there was a story of somebody who fell in love with nature again, which we're wont to do here now in our time. And he wanted to take his girlfriend up to see the bears. It was either in Alaska or Canada. I can't remember which country. And the forest ranger stopped him because it had been a terrible winter. And he said, you can't go up there right now. If you do, you're likely to get eaten by the bears. And he loved bears. And he wanted his girlfriend to see the bears. And so he took her up there, and she started her period, and the bears ripped her apart and ate her. That's what the people of this time were like. They were like animals. They had descended to the creature. And so warfare, and we'll see this, especially when Babylon and Persia start fighting. This was really civilized compared to what's going to happen. And it's not going to happen to the Canaanites. It's going to happen to Israel when they get conquered by other people. And you will see the same type of treachery. You'll see the worst of mankind coming out. But God loves us, even though we are who we are. And it's like I said, he's making a space. He's making where we need to be for his son to come into the world. And to do that, in order to get the good news out about how you're really supposed to live and what God is really like, he's got to make a place for him. And this is how he does it. And if he had not been with them, they would have been slaughtered when they came out of Egypt, right? Just like an invading army. And but I am sorry for that. But we can't go with the heresy of throw the Old Testament out, because if we did that, we could never understand the New Testament. I hope that helps, Dewey. It is horrifying, though, I will tell you. And it will be equally horrifying when Israel starts being on the other side of it, and they will be.
Okay.
All right, so chapter 1 is when we right now are right about here. All of Israel is waiting to go onto this side where the Canaanites live. And God tells Joshua that he's going to be with him the way he was with Moses. He reassures him. But he also says you have to do according to all the laws Moses commanded, turning not to the right or to the left. And that's part of the harem, the holy war. That's going to be hard for them to do, is to follow God's commands, which include empty out this land, because if you don't, they will come back and kill you. The Reubenites, the Gadites, and half of the tribe of Manasseh have all agreed that they're going to stay on this side of the Jordan River. And Moses told them before he died, and Joshua reaffirms that they will have this land, but they have to go over and fight with him. And they tell Joshua that just as they would follow Moses, they will follow him. So Israel gets ready by sending some spies into Jericho, this time just 2 people. And they go to Jericho and they stay at the house of Rahab the harlot. And James Tissot is one of my favorite painters. Here's his rendition of Rahab and the 2 spies from Israel. And as soon as they come into her house, other people have seen them go in. It's reported back to the king, and the king sends people to her place of business to say, hey, those 2 guys, they're spying out our land. We need them. And she says, oh, and they've already they went out the gate. And if you go fast, you'll probably catch them. And so all of the troops from Jericho leave the city, go through the gate closes behind them. Then she goes up onto the rooftop where she has hidden these 2 under a bunch of flax. And she tells them that she knows Israel's story, that she knows that they left Egypt, that God parted the sea for them, that they're this mighty people with God on their side. And she asked them to remember her kindness and to save her own family when they take Jericho over. And then she says, you need to get out of here. What? Yes, Dewey? Oh.
Thanks. I'm on time. I might be interested.
Oh, Joni, somebody needs to mute, whoever might not, unless you have a question. Anyway, so she's going to lower them out the window so that they can escape into the hills, right? All those cities back then had walls around them because they were constantly being attacked by other tribes. And the only way that you could try to protect your city was to wall it in. She was on the outer wall, so her window would drop off this wall and they could head into the hills. But before they go, they give her a scarlet cord and they say, listen, you tie this in your window and then bring all your family in here and anything else you want to save. Anything in this room is safe, but if anything is outside this room, their blood is on their own hands. And so they leave. She ties the cord in her window and she lowers them by the rope, and they hide for 3 days out in the hill. And then they return to the camp in Gilgal and they tell Joshua that, this is of people who are broken. Their hearts, they're terrified of us. We would be safe in going and attacking them. And so they get ready to cross the Jordan. And first of all, the night before they're going to do it, Joshua sends the people around to tell everybody, listen, when the ark comes by you, the Ark of the Covenant, right? This is God's footstool. And the picture you can see here, he is in his pillar of cloud with them. And he says, after this ark passes by, all of you fall in behind it. And Yahweh has told him that when the priests step into the water of the Jordan, that the water will back up, and no longer will the Jordan flow to the Dead Sea or the Salt Sea, but it will just back itself up, and they can walk through on dry land, right? This sounds remarkably familiar, right? It sounds like the same thing that happened with Moses. And so the people pass over on dry land. And Yahweh also said, pick 12 out of one from each tribe and go out into the Jordan when it's all backed up and pick up 12 river stones, because I'm going to have you make an altar of them. And that is how you are going to remember what I've done for you. So they pass out of the Jordan to become God's new creation. And again, this is a type of baptism, right? They passed out of Egypt through the Red Sea and they became a new creation. And now they pass across the Jordan River and they become a new creation in Yahweh. Just like you and I and our children, when we have them baptized, become a new creation after that water of baptism touches them, whether it's poured on their head or whether they're immersed, they become a new creation in baptism. And so this is a type of baptism. Chapter 5, they prepare for battle. First of all, there's circumcision, right? Again, this is very reflective of what happened before they crossed the Red Sea. The circumcision, that was the sign of the covenant with God. Well, while they were wandering for 40 years through the desert, all the older people, all the older men were circumcised, but none of the children that were born after that were. So Yahweh says, you know, we need the sign of the covenant. And so circumcision occurs, and then they celebrate the Passover with the fruits from the promised land. All this time while they were in the desert, God has been feeding them with manna. But now, as soon as they celebrate Passover, which is the same thing that they did, right, the night before they left Egypt, now the day before or the day after they get across the Jordan, they do the same thing. They eat the Passover meal, the manna stops, which means the desert wandering is over. And we see that Joshua has a vision. He meets the commander of the Lord's army. And he says, you know, are you friend or are you foe? And he says, I am neither. I am the captain of Yahweh's army. And then he tells Joshua, put off your shoes from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy. Right? This is going to be the same place that Jesus Christ comes to get baptized in the Jordan River. And it indeed is a holy place, much holier than Joshua will ever know until Jesus comes and opens the gates of heaven. An awesome picture of Saint Michael, the leader of God's army. So in chapter 6, we read about Joshua fit the battle of Jericho. Now, I used to tell my CCD kids, we studied Jericho, and I'd be, you guys all know this song, right? Joshua fit the battle like Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. They'd look at me like I was crazy. And not just because I can't sing very well, but because they didn't know this song. But it's pretty much like the song says. Yahweh instructs them, you're going to take the Ark of the Covenant, which is pictured right here, and you're going to go, and for 6 days, you're just going to walk around Jericho. I always love these Renaissance paintings because they make Jericho look like a European town. But it's kind of a nice rendition. You can see the trumpets. They're going to be blaring on these 7 trumpets as they slowly walk around once for 6 days. People are not going to make a sound. That's the instruction until the 7th day. And on the 7th day, they're going to actually walk around it 7 times, and the trumpets are going to be a blaring. And when they finally give this final blare of the trumpets, all the people are going to give a great war cry, and the walls of Jericho are going to fall down, and then they are going to raise the city. They are going to kill everything in it and keep nothing except the precious metals. So the walls come a tumbling down. They save the precious metals, and they save Rahab and her family because they had made a vow to her. And so if you happen to have your Bible handy with you, again, this is why you can't throw the Old Testament away. If you turn to Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, and if you are going to look in your Bible, it's on page 1269, right at the beginning of Matthew. There's a genealogy of Jesus Christ. And so it has all these people who begot all these people. When you get to verse 5, it says, and Solomon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab, right? Rahab was Boaz's mother. And Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth. At the very end of this lesson, I'm going to suggest that you read the book of Ruth. It's only like 3 pages long. It's very, very short, and it's the sweetest story. It's a nice break from having everybody being mean and killing everybody. But right, Rahab, this prostitute, makes it into the genealogy of Christ. So in lesson 7, we get the lesson of Ai. Now, Ai was a town that they were, right, they've now taken Jericho, the first big battle of getting all of that land that was east of the Jordan River. And it's a descendant of Judah, Achan, that has stolen some booty from Jericho, right? God said, don't take anything except the precious metals and put those into the tent of meeting. But no, Achan decides that he needs some silver, some gold, a really pretty mantle, you know, that he could put around his shoulders. So he goes and buries them in his tent. Well, God knows everything, and God is furious. Well, but Joshua doesn't know. So Joshua sends a couple spies up to Ai, and he says, look, check it out. And they come back to him and they say, you know, they're not very strong. It'll do just to send like 3,000 of us. We don't need the whole force. So 3,000 go up there, and they get to Ai, and the people of Ai are ferocious, and they come out, those 3,000, and they chicken out, and they're running away from them. 36 of them are actually killed and then cut into pieces. Again, warfare back then, and just culture, was unbelievably harsh. And when Israel lost a battle, they suffered the same way as when their enemies did when they won a battle. Well, so then God says, well, Joshua is upset. He's like, oh, why did we leave Egypt? We've won these battles. We can stay on the east side of the Jordan if that's what you want us to do. But, everybody's going to make fun of you because we're not going to be victorious. And God is still furious. And he says, listen, I want to tell you something, and that is somebody stole some booty. And what I want you to do is I want you to take all the tribes of Israel and bring them by the meeting tent. And it says that it was decided by lots. It was probably that Urim and Thummim that we talked about before, those two stones that they used in order to know, oh, it was somebody from the tribe of Judah. So then they had all the families of Judah walk before the tent. And oh, Achan's family is the one that gets picked out by Lot. And so then Joshua confronts him and says, tell me what you did. And so Achan spills his guts. And then they carry out what Yahweh said, right? Achan is basically a traitor. And so Achan and his whole family are burned and stoned. And he gets a felon's burial, which is to pile rocks on top of him. And so there's a picture by Gustave Doré of Achan in the valley of Angkor. But something that you'll notice if you read the footnotes, even in Jeff Cavan's Bible, Jeff Cavan's puts fewer footnotes than anybody. He kind of lets you just read and is not constantly, trying to inform you of everything. But he also points out that both Jericho and Ai are probably his history adjusted to theology, is the way I put it. Yes, they would have had to take Jericho, but the real walls of Jericho, the great big walls of Jericho, came down way before Moses's time. They didn't come down with the blast of trumpets then. And there would have been another wall built around Jericho, but not the wall described. And but the battle would have occurred. And now, right, you've got these priestly and Deuteronomical editors coming in, and they're adding some theology on top of it and some lessons learned, which is, number one, you always follow the commands of God. And number two, if you don't, Yahweh will see to it that you are punished for whatever sins you commit. And so and Cavins also points out that using the ban, the harem, the holy war, where you kill everything, probably was not done as much as described. But in past, looking at their history, the priestly are kind of embellishing the battles of Moses. So Ai is taken and raised. Joshua decides, right, first Ai has taken these 3,000 guys and made them run away and killed 36 of them. And now Joshua says, because Yahweh is telling him, here's the tactic to use. Send half of your troops back behind the town, and then do that at night in secret. They're going to be our ambush. And then you take the rest of the people and you just come at the front of that city. And so that's what Joshua does. He takes his group, he puts them right in the front of the city. And when the people of Ai wake up in the morning and see them, they're like, oh, get your sabers out. We're going to war. And they rush out, and immediately Joshua and the Israelites that he has with him hightail it out of there like they're afraid. And so these guys are thinking, all right, we got them on the run. Everybody runs out of the city. And then the ambush does what Joshua told them to do. They close in on the city and they start it on fire. Well, so now everybody from Ai turns around. They see their city burning up, and they see the guys in front of them turn around, and they're not hightailing it anymore. They've drawn their own sabers. Now they're surrounded on two sides. And yes, everybody is once again killed. And the king is taken alive. He's killed in front of all of them. This is, in fact, always what warfare was about and still is about. If you can kill the commanding officer, if you can kill the king, the president, and do it in front of everybody, it teaches a special lesson, right? The Nuremberg trials after World War II, what did you do to all of the Nazis? You brought them out and you hung them from wire in front of the whole population to show this is what happens when you murder people wholesale. And so they take the king, they kill him, they hang him on a tree. But in Deuteronomy, which we didn't read, but there's a rule in there that if you take your enemy and hang him on a tree, you have to take him down before the sun sets. And so they did that. And then Joshua goes to the top of Mount Ebal. Here's a picture of Ebal. And it says that half of the people line up on Jerusalem or on Mount Gerizim, which is over right next to it. So half of the people are here, half of the people are here. Joshua goes up and builds an altar on Mount Ebal. And guess what? Today, if you go to Mount Ebal, there is an archaeological dig on the top of it. And surely there is an ancient altar that was built there. And he makes sacrifices in thanksgiving to Yahweh for giving them the battle. And then he reads the law to all the people. And back on that other slide, when I was saying it was history that was sort of adjusted for theology's purposes, one of the things that is true is Ai is not anywhere near where they were fighting, and they're not. It's not near Mount Gerizim nor Mount Ebal. This is actually the city of Shechem down here, and Ai lies in the land of Joshua, which is far away, and so that wouldn't really have occurred right there. It was moved around by these editors for effect. In chapters 9 through 12, Israel continues the fight. And they are tricked themselves, right? They were told to clear all the land, but there is a people, they're not really Canaanites. The Gibeonites were not descendants of Cana, and they're actually a pretty passive group, and maybe that's why God allowed them to trick Israel. Because what they do is they see, man, Israel, when they take people, they destroy them all. This is a haram, it's a holy war. They're going to just annihilate us. So what we'll do is we'll get our oldest clothes on, we'll get our stale bread, we'll just be covered with dust and dirt. And they do that. They get wine skins that are all cracked, like they're super old. And they go and they offer the bread to Israel. Right? Earlier when we were reading, one of the tribes that got destroyed by Israel, Yahweh said, well, they didn't come and offer you bread. And we remember way back when Melchizedek came out to offer Abraham and Lot bread and wine after their victory, right? He was the high priest of Salem or Jerusalem. And so now the Gibeonites are offering bread, and they're saying, you know, we've heard about your great God. We've come from a very far distant land. Look at us, you know, because Joshua's suspect. He's like, well, where are you from, the local area? Oh, no. Look at us. Look at our wineskins. Look at our bread. It's all stale. Well, already Israel has eaten of their bread. And when doing that, they have made a vow. And then they confirm it, that they, since they're from far away and they have come because of Yahweh, they're going to let them live. And then, but they didn't consult Yahweh, so he didn't really weigh in on it. But you know, they were kind of a passive people anyway, and so maybe he really did weigh in by not, you know, poking them and saying, hey, you should consult me. But the people are pissed at Joshua because they want to kill the Gibeonites. They're like, they are local people. We found it out. Let's get rid of them. But we already learned about vows earlier. If you make a vow, you keep a vow. And that's what Joshua explains to them. We vowed to the Gibeonites that we would protect their lives, and we are going to do that. And so the Gibeonites get away with it. And in fact, they have 3 cities where they live, And these three cities will see again, the Gibeonites come back into the story of the Old Testament. So God sees that Israel conquers the south from Kadesh Barnea, that's that oasis where they camped oftentimes during that 40 years of wandering, all the way to Gaza. Gaza's up here. So this whole southern area they have now taken. And the Gibeonites actually fall into that story because there are all these tribes that are now organizing against Israel. They see this foreign people coming in, taking the land. They decide to stop fighting with each other and fight together in order to destroy Israel. And they see that the Gibeonites have sided with Israel. So the first thing they're going to go is to go and destroy them. And the Gibeonites call to Israel, right? They send a messenger and they say, hey, these guys are coming to destroy us and you promised to protect us. And so Israel comes, Joshua comes, brings the army, and in Gibeon, they defeat the 5 kings. And it is, as always in that warfare, ugly. The 5 kings are put into a cave, they're stoned in alive, and then they take them out, they slaughter them, they hang them on trees. They take them down before the sunset. They shove them back in the cave and put the stones back in front of it. Again, a felon's death. And yeah, and an ugly scene, but the south is taken. Then they go back to Gilgal, which is right over by Jericho. It's on the west side of the Jordan, near Jericho. They regroup and then they go for the north. And we get a description of, again, the bloody battles that are fought in the north. And Joshua defeats all the pagan kings and exterminates their tribes. So now all this land from just north of the Sea of Galilee all the way to the south belongs to the tribes of Israel. And in Joshua chapter 11, verse 23, it says, and the land had rest from war. Thankfully, because that's hard reading. It's brutal to read it. And, but we have now made it through, and the tribes take their places. And that goes from chapters 13 to 24, which I didn't have you read, and you can read them over Thanksgiving break if you want to, but it's really without a map, and we don't even know all the geographic areas. We kind of know them in general, and that's how this map is made. But that's what they're doing. The land is divided up amongst the tribes, just as this map shows. And notice there's no Levi in here anywhere, because if you're a son of Aaron, you're a priest. If you are a Levite, then you work for the priests, and you don't get any of your own land. You live off tithes, and you get cities. We talked about that last week, how you get 6 cities of refuge for people who inadvertently murdered somebody, and those would be the Levite cities too, and then 42 other cities. And so they'll have cities scattered throughout all of these places, and the people will tithe them, and that's how they'll live. And they get a little bit of land right around the walls of the city. Gad and Reuben and half of Manasseh, they've now done what they said they'd do. They helped them conquer all of this land, and now they're ready to cross back over and go back to their children, their families, their cattle. And if you read the story, they actually almost get in trouble with the rest of these tribes, because as they're crossing over the Jordan, they decide that they're going to build an altar. And the only altar where burnt offerings can be made is the altar in front of the tent of meeting. And everybody who's from Israel should realize that. And when they see him building an altar, they think they're going to make their own burnt sacrifices, and they're ready to attack him. And Gad and Reuben, the heads of their tribes, say, oh, no, 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 this wasn't for burnt offerings. It was just an altar that we're building to show that we are all one big family. We are a team, and this is how our children will remember. We will tell our children that they are part of this greater Israel. And so that makes these guys happy. They decide it's okay if that's all it is just a sign of welcome, a sign of unity between the tribes, as long as they're not going to make burnt offerings. And you're going to see this come up again once Jerusalem, the temple in Jerusalem is built. All of the priests will say the only place you offer sacrifice is right here in Jerusalem. And because that's where the Holy of Holies is going to be. And before they all split, Joshua reminds them of what the Lord has done for them, how he's given them this land, and he renews the covenant with the people. He reads the law to them again. He reminds them what their obligation is. He reminds them that God has already come through with his obligation, and that he'll continue to protect them as long as they live out the law. And in the very last chapter, Joshua and Eleazar die. And now we are ready to move into a new history of Israel, which is the history of the judges. And so you can read chapters 13 through 24 if you want. That's basically what it's going to tell you. But on December 2nd, where we're going to pick up at is Judges 1 through 16. This is different from the syllabus, right? Because I X'd out the end of the book of Joshua. And instead, we'll read Judges 1 through 16. And I'll issue a new syllabus after Thanksgiving. I kind of had stopped working just to see if the pace was right, if we were doing okay. These are my picks. It would be Judges chapters 3 and 4, and then 13 through 16 is the story of Samson. If you've ever seen the movie of Samson and Delilah, your jaw will drop again when you read 13 through 16. That's one of the things about reading the Bible is you find out how Hollywood often does not portray things very accurately. And read the book of Ruth if you have time. It is the sweetest book. As I say, it's only 3 pages, and I really love it. And have the best Thanksgiving ever. May God bless those days, these next 2 weeks. May all your family be kept safe. May any of us who have experience with COVID recover from it, and may God keep us all safe. So anyway, we are done with the book of Joshua, and I'm going to stop recording.